Thanks everyone for joining us today. We're very pleased to be able to share the results of our research with you. And the research we are presenting today was carried out by Pembina and funded by the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions. And our research has been peer-reviewed by a number of folks from various sectors. So the report we're presenting today is called LNG and Climate Change, the Global Context. Can I get the next slide? Great. So in case anybody out there is not familiar with Pembina, we are a national nonpartisan nonprofit organization, and we are focused primarily on transitioning Canada to a clean energy future. You can see we have offices across the country, and this research was produced out of our Vancouver office. Out of our BC office, we do a number of different things, including working on the transition to net zero buildings, a transition to the clean energy economy, and raising awareness of LNG impacts, which is part of where this project fits into our work. Next slide, please. Great. So just a bit of an overview of what we're going to be covering today, and before I do that, I just want to mention that the context of what we are talking about today in terms of LNG and its impacts is focused on climate. And there are certainly a number of other impacts that need to be considered in the LNG discussion, including the potential economic impacts and benefits that the province has been stressing. We know that First Nations and communities in the Northwest have raised concerns about the impacts on salmon habitat and air quality, and First Nations and communities in the Northeast have raised concerns about the impacts from shale gas development required to feed the LNG terminals themselves. So all of these are extremely important in the overall LNG conversation. Our presentation today does focus primarily on climate. So we're going to start with a bit of context just of the current situation with LNG in BC. I'll describe our research approach, how we did this work. Then I'll be passing it over to Matt to describe our findings and supporting research, and then we'll wrap up with the recommendations that we have come to after finishing this research. Next slide. So when we talk about carbon pollution from LNG, there are actually a number of pieces to the puzzle, so we'll just take a moment to pull those apart. So the diagram you see on your screen helps to differentiate the different pieces from each other. So we'll start with the red dot, and the red dot represents the emissions from the terminals themselves. And then moving to the orange dot, this represents the emissions from transporting the natural gas by pipeline to the terminals. And finally, the blue dot represents the emissions from producing the natural gas itself. Now, the province initially promised to address all three sources, but narrowed that promise to focus only on the terminals. So we saw last fall that the province introduced legislation to regulate carbon from the LNG terminals themselves, only the red dot, but has yet to regulate carbon emissions or pollution from either the blue or orange dots. Most of the debate to date has focused on the BC part of the picture and how all of this carbon pollution will make it impossible for the province to meet its climate targets. We won't be talking too much about that today. We'll be focusing actually on the other side of this image, on the gray dot. So the gray dot represents the emissions associated with burning LNG, and trying to better understand the overall climate impact of this gray dot is the goal of the research that we undertook. Next slide, please. So we know that the BC government has consistently claimed that exporting LNG from BC is the single greatest step we can take to fight climate change. Specifically, the government has been claiming that LNG will help to displace coal used for electricity generation in Asia. But to date, they haven't provided any evidence to support this claim, and our research shows that these claims are inaccurate. Next slide. So our research shows that, contrary to the government's claim, natural gas will not reduce coal use and will not help solve climate change in a world with weak climate policies in place, which unfortunately is the world we currently are living in, more or less. But if we cast our minds to the possibility of a world with strong climate policy in place, things like carbon pricing, phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, and banning coal-fired power plants, we would see two things happen. The first is we would see the demand for natural gas peak by 2030 and then drop below current levels by mid-century. This would be the result of climate policy shifting decision-making towards lower carbon alternatives. The second result of strong climate policies would be that energy efficiency, renewables, and nuclear become the main players in a transition away from fossil fuels. In other words, it's the climate policy that will determine the energy mix and whether we are headed towards dangerous climate change, not simply the availability of natural gas. Next slide, please. So let's take a second to look at the government's claim and unpack it a little bit. Essentially, this claim is based on two assumptions. And the first assumption is that natural gas is less polluting than coal. And the second assumption is that natural gas, the export of LNG will displace coal. If these two assumptions are true, it would lead to the outcome that overall carbon pollution would drop. Next slide. Unfortunately, the reality is not that simple. So let's take a look at each of these assumptions individually. So assumption one, which is that natural gas is less polluting than coal, we are calling, for the sake of argument, mostly right. There's still uncertainty around this question, but in most cases, natural gas will likely be 10 to 40% cleaner than coal, depending on its source, and assuming methane is well managed. Now, that assumption is something that is worth taking a few moments on. Because the methane and how it's managed is the key issue in this debate about exactly what the comparison of natural gas to coal is. For methane, this science is still evolving, and in many natural gas producing areas, we actually lack measurements of actual emissions. You may have seen a wide range of estimates produced on exactly how intense methane is. And those range from essentially negligible in the life cycle to significant enough to make gas actually dirtier than coal. Now, our review of the literature found that actual methane levels are likely higher than reported, but likely not as high on average as the worst case observations. There's just a range of results out there, so it's hard to know, hard to pick one number as an average. But much of that variation depends on the technologies and practices employed to manage methane. So if best practices are followed, then gas is less polluting than coal in most cases. So taken all together, we will say that assumption one is mostly right. Assumption two, however, is flawed. So our research shows that it's climate policy that will determine coal use, not the availability of LNG or natural gas. And in the absence of strong climate policy, LNG simply feeds an increasing energy demand with additional fossil fuels, putting the world squarely on a trajectory to dangerous climate change. The other reason that assumption two is flawed is that it assumes a two-fuel system, when in fact the overall energy mix is more complex than this and includes oil, renewables, nuclear, and energy efficiency. So it's not simply a question of LNG and coal, it's a question of looking at the overall energy mix to understand what the total impact on the climate will be. Next slide. So I'll tell you a little bit about our research approach here, and then Matt will dive into our findings more specifically to outline how we came to these conclusions. So we reviewed existing research to assess essentially two things. What is the role of natural gas in a world with weak climate policies, which is essentially the world we live in today? And what is the role of natural gas in a world with strong climate policies, which is the world we're trying to transition to? And again, by strong climate policies, We mean things like carbon pricing, a phase out of fossil fuel subsidies, pollution standards for power plants, etc. And so we looked at the energy mix in those different scenarios and specifically looked at the role of natural gas in each of those scenarios. So I'll pass it over to Matt to provide you with some of our more detailed findings.
Thanks, Joshua. Thanks, everyone, for joining. So, yeah, I'm going to walk through our three main findings and then talk a little bit about our recommendations and some of the provincial government's response to the work to date. So the first is sort of looking squarely in a world with weak climate change policy and in essence trying to make the point that an increase in natural gas demand globally does not necessarily translate into a decrease in coal use. So the slide here is showing global natural gas demand, so the two bars in gray for 2011 and 2035, and global coal demand in 2011 and 2035, the dark gray bars. And this is taken from the International Energy Agency's World Energy Outlook. So you can see in the light gray bars a fairly substantial increase in natural gas demand over that time period. But what you don't see is a corresponding or a similar decrease in coal use. So in essence, in a world with weak climate change policies, that increase in natural gas demand does not lead to a decrease in coal demand. And if we're not finding a way to cut global coal demand and to cut it significantly and rapidly, we're not going to be meaningfully addressing climate change. So the second finding, this is looking more specifically at the role of natural gas, and specifically the role of natural gas in a world with strong climate change policy. So what the chart here is showing is global natural gas demand, the blue line representing global natural gas demand in a world with weak climate change policy, and the orange line representing global natural gas demand in a world with strong climate change policies. And a few sort of key differences here, and just to mention, so this is showing the results of one model. The results or the conclusions I'll draw from it do hold across the roughly 15 models we looked at. So 3 points to draw from this. One, you see in the world with stronger climate change policy, the demand for global demand for natural gas is lower than in the world with weak climate change policy. There's a peak roughly around 2030, and that depends on the model. So post 2030, we start to see declines in global natural gas demand, and then sort of roughly by mid-century, global natural gas demand dropping below current levels. So again, I think that the main point here, there's a role for natural gas in that world with strong climate change policy. It's definitely lower than a world with weak climate change policy, and I think a phrase often used to describe natural gas is as a bridge fuel, and so looking at this evidence, that bridge, if we're to use that term, is shorter and narrower than many people would describe it, and there is a real risk that it gets overbuilt if you're sort of looking at the amount of demand for natural gas in a world with weak climate change policies. So the final finding here just takes a step back to the overall energy mix and not specifically on the role of natural gas. And what the slide here is showing is the change in energy demand projections for the different types of main energy sources, basically the difference between a world with strong climate change policy and a world with weak climate change policy. So you can, and again, this is from the International Energy Agency's World Energy Outlook, and you can see significantly lower projections for demand for coal, oil, and natural gas, the main fossil fuels, and sort of an increase in nuclear and renewable energy on the supply side, and the biggest shift there, a big increase in energy efficiency to make up for that decreased demand for coal, oil, and natural gas. So what we're looking at here is not a transition of coal to gas, as it's often described, but it's a broader transition. As if the world moves to strong climate change policies, it's a broader transition from fossil fuels, away from fossil fuels, towards nuclear, renewables, and most importantly, energy efficiency. So just to quickly summarize those findings, we've got, again, in a world with weak climate change policies, increased natural gas use will not necessarily reduce coal use, and without that reduction in coal use, we're not going to meaningfully address climate change. And in a world with strong climate change policies, there is a role for natural gas. It's smaller than it would otherwise be, and so peaking around 2030 and dropping below current levels by mid-century. And the broader transition, again, is not one of coal to gas. It's from fossil fuels to renewables, nuclear, and energy efficiency. And just one point to add to this, we've had sort of this question pop up a little bit around sort of because some of the recent announcements, particularly sort of later in the fall, like the U.S.-China agreement around climate change and some of the optimism coming out of the global climate talks in Lima, are we sort of getting closer to that sort of world with strong climate change policies? And I would say that although there definitely are some signs of optimism in sort of the lead up to the large climate talks in Paris later this year, we're still definitely not in that sort of world of strong climate change policies, and there's some pretty heavy lifting to do. So while there are some good examples around the world of good climate change policy, we have a ways to go to get those to be standard practice around the globe and sort of continuing to strengthen and build over time. One other point to mention, this is another study that came up pretty much the same time as the PICS white paper was released from the Journal of Nature. And so as our work was reviewing existing models, this was like a complementary piece that did some new modeling. And they had 5 teams internationally looking at 5 different models, specifically testing scenarios with abundant, relatively affordable natural gas. So not surprisingly, they saw big increases in global natural gas supply, sort of up to 170% increases in demand out towards the middle of the century. What they didn't see was a decrease in CO2 levels or CO2 emissions. So I think the quote there sums it up pretty well. Without new climate change policies, abundant supplies of natural gas will have little impact on greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. So as part of this paper, we offered 3 main recommendations to the provincial government. So I'll quickly walk through those and talk a little bit about what some of the provincial response was. So the first was to apply a consistent evidence-based approach in assessing energy exports. On the consistent piece, when we sort of look at essentially the province not saying anything one way or another when it comes to exporting coal and oil to the province versus the approach it's taken on LNG, which is to trumpet it as a climate solution. I think their overall approach would be strengthened if there was consistency across the board there. And again, to make sure those are as evidence-based as possible. And as we pointed out in this research, there's definitely a lack of evidence on the LNG claims particularly. The second was to strengthen domestic efforts to reduce carbon pollution. I think this is an area where the province has a reasonably good track record with policies such as the carbon tax, the low carbon fuel standard, the clean energy requirement, and other pieces that all came in as part of the climate action plan sort of back in 2007 through 2009. And so I think you're sort of looking at a package of policies there that really do offer some, on balance, good economic and environmental success stories from the province. And in terms of making a contribution to the broader global effort, we would argue that the best opportunity that BC has is to strengthen those efforts domestically. And that leads into our third recommendation, which was to play an increasingly proactive role in encouraging stronger climate policy globally. And I think BC is really well positioned to do this, in part because of some of those successes we have under our belts over the last 5 or 6 years. And there's an opportunity to share with the world what's been working and share, again, as well, so what some of the challenges have been, so that other jurisdictions can learn from those lessons and figure out what approaches make sense in their own jurisdictions. In terms of provincial response, I think the overall piece, based on the environment ministers discussing the report a little bit in the debate around the province's LNG legislation in the fall of last year, was generally positive. We're describing it as a constructive, well-researched contribution to the debate around LNG in the province. If we look at the response on the specific recommendations, I don't think there's been any significant sort of shift in the province's messaging on sort of LNG and its role as a climate solution or not. So in terms of our first recommendation, would still be encouraging the province to apply a more consistent approach and to really make sure it is backed by evidence. The second and third, actually, I think there has been some positive movement and certainly room to go further, and hopefully that will be followed up on in 2015. So if we're looking at the efforts to reduce carbon pollution domestically, the Environment Minister has been increasingly talking about the need and opportunity for a second phase of the Climate Action Plan. She's also been in that same debate around the LNG legislation in the fall, talked about the upstream emissions associated with LNG and sort of from the gas processing plants and wellheads in Northeast BC, and ensuring there's a stronger effort to reduce those sources of carbon pollution. So if there's just follow up on those commitments as we move into 2015, I think there are some really good opportunities for the province. And on the third recommendation, in terms of playing an increasingly proactive role, I think we did see looking at the Environment Minister and some of her staff down in the Lima talks in December, certainly a much more proactive role from BC compared to the previous talks in Warsaw the year prior to that. So hopefully that continues to build in the lead up to Paris. And I think another good example in that space would be Premier Clark's meetings with Premier Wynne in Ontario, and carbon tax and carbon pricing being sort of a part of those conversations. So I think is an area really where the province does have some interesting experiences to share, and hopefully that is a growing part of their work over the coming year. So with that, I'd like to say thank you and turn it over to Kevin to manage the questions from here.
So the first question for you, Matt, is does the analysis of coal versus natural gas include methane release from coal mining?
That's a good question. So I wouldn't speak to all the studies that are out there, but a good one and a recent one would be the National Research Lab study looking at, this was a case, sort of a life cycle comparison of coal versus natural gas. And in that study, they looked at sort of different options for gas, whether it be LNG from the US or natural gas by pipeline from Russia, and sort of different sort of sources, either whether that's being used in Asia or being used in Europe, comparing to coal. So in that case, I think they did quite a good job of sort of a full life cycle assessment, including both the methane and other emissions from upstream gas production, and also some of the methane emissions from coal mining. I think, again, Josh has spoke to some of the uncertainty around natural gas methane. The same would apply to coal mining where methane is released, but there is an effort to include it in that study. And I think any of the good life cycle studies that are out there that you'll see do attempt to compare both, include all of those sources.
One for you, Joshua. In BC, is most of the LNG that would be piped to these West Coast ports sourced from the fracking process?
Thanks, Kevin. Yes, a large percentage of the gas would come from Northeast BC, and yes, a large percentage of that would be from fracked gas.
Okay. All right. Another question for you, Matt. Howarth 2014 recent synthesis indicates methane global warming potential over a 20-year time scale is 86 to 105 times stronger than CO2 when it comes to its global warming potential. Hard to agree that the assumption that we made in the case of the two assumptions under the government's claim, being that LNG could displace coal, is mostly right, meaning that natural gas burns more efficiently or cleaner than coal. So it's hard to agree with that assumption, given the difference in global warming potential and the change, suggesting it's 86 to 100 times stronger than CO2. So could you comment on that, Matt?
Yeah, and thanks for the question. I think there's definitely debate around that issue out there. So maybe a couple of points on that. As Josh has said, there are definitely instances where, if you look at some of the worst case sort of findings that people have found around methane emissions from oil and natural gas sites, where if you look at the high levels of methane leakage, there's enough there that it definitely undoes the benefit relative to coal. So there certainly are cases where that's the case. One of the issues sort of alluded to in the question is, are we looking at this over a 100-year time frame or over a 20-year time frame? And I think that's been a fairly recent shift in the literature, and you're finding a lot of studies now looking at comparisons both on a 100-year time frame and a 20-year time frame. So there are some, and Haworth was the one mentioning the question, where they're saying that their conclusion is that that sort of, especially in a shorter time frame, it wipes out that benefit. I think I did think the NREL study I mentioned did a good job of that, looking at both 100-year and 80-year time frames, and their findings were that in cases, if methane on average is being well managed, you do have a benefit in almost all cases, except where you have very, very long pipelines. Another, I think, a study we did refer to this a fair bit in this white paper was from Brandt from last year, that looks again at sort of tries to compile together all of the findings that are out there and look at how they compare against with each other. And what he found was that definitely recognizing there are some of those worst case scenarios, that he didn't find it to be realistic that the worst case scenarios were reflective of the average performance. So while average performance is likely higher than is reported in many cases, it's not high enough to take away that benefit on a life cycle basis versus coal. Just the one thing I would say, I think is the field has been, the research and the literature in the space has definitely been shifting over the last few years. So I think that's our sense of the literature today, but I wouldn't at all dismiss that from moving in one direction or another as new research comes out over the coming years.
And a follow-up question to that, Matt, related to the same study of Horwath in 2014. Can recommendation 2 from our recommendation slides be expanded to consider methane specifically? So just a reminder that recommendation was that we strengthen domestic efforts to reduce carbon pollution.
Yeah, and it's a good point that I totally agree with. I think when you're looking at opportunities to cut carbon pollution in BC, they appear across the economy, whether it's transportation, buildings, upstream gas as well. I think when you're looking in the LNG debate, there's a specific opportunity to strengthen policies around emissions management and upstream gas, and methane being a significant part of that. So if you look in BC right now, that there's some very good reporting requirements and some good studies that have happened to understand what the levels of methane are. From a policy perspective, it jumps out as a bit of a gap in the province's climate framework. So we have the carbon tax that applies to most sources of carbon pollution in the province, but when you look at vented or leaked methane, for example, there's not really any policy encouraging companies to reduce those sources. So definitely a gap and an opportunity going forward for the province.
So a question for you, Joshua. What is meant by strong climate policy? Does this mean the carbon tax?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Yeah, the carbon tax or carbon pricing in general would definitely be a key component of what's considered strong climate policy. Other things like phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, banning coal-fired power plants, low carbon fuel standards, those types of things as well. There's actually, if you are further interested, the IEA study does list out quite a number of particular policies that it considers part of strong climate policy as well, and those differ from region to region depending on sort of the state of development of different countries. But the carbon pricing is a fundamental piece that would be included in that.
As a follow-up to that question, if strong climate change policies are enacted and global demand falls post-2030, will BC contend with stranded assets? Is this risk a disincentive for the province to support stronger climate policies and leave it in the ground?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I think when you do look at that demand curve with strong climate policies in place, then you see that by mid-century we're going to be down, the demand for natural gas will drop below what it is currently. I think this is a very important question for the province to be contending with. What kind of infrastructure do we want to be investing in for the overall health of the economy as a whole, but also specifically from the point of view of the communities that will be most directly impacted by that infrastructure development, and what that means for those local economies and socioeconomic situations. If we are, if we do put those strong climate policies in place, I mean, I think the term stranded assets becomes quite appropriate. I would say that this risk is an incentive for the province to support stronger. Oh, okay, I see the question right. So ultimately, I think the whether or not the province supports stronger climate policies, this is going to be a global movement, and we're going to be impacted by global climate policy. Is going to be impacting the demand for natural gas, not just here, but across the world. So I would encourage BC to take this opportunity to get out in front of that curve and just start thinking about how we're going to be gearing our economy for that low carbon future, instead of locking us into infrastructure and fossil fuel development that's not going to be very economically viable once the rest of the globe starts shifting to stronger climate policy.
I was just going to, Matt here, just to add a little bit to that response. I think there is a risk that sort of jurisdictions get invested in an energy source that isn't sort of aligned with that transition to a low carbon future, and it essentially become opponents of that transition. There's some interesting examples, particularly coming out of the Northeast U.S., that I think policy can be designed to sort of create that alignment or sort of reduce that risk. And this has mostly been around power plants, but where there's been some coal to gas transition, so there's sort of a short-term cut in carbon pollution, but they've built into the sort of the operating requirements or policy guidelines for those natural gas plants they're different than what they might have been 20 or 30 years ago. So instead of giving them a contract to operate for 30 to 50 years, they've in some cases made those operating contracts much shorter, and they've also built in requirements for the levels of carbon pollution to drop over time, so that in their power purchasing agreements, or depending on the regulatory sort of permits, there's built-in requirements or controls that those levels drop over time and sort of help guard against some of those risks that are being referred to in the question.
Okay, lots of good questions, everyone. We'll do our best to address them all. Here's a good one, and actually there's two parts to this. But the first is that the role of nuclear in solving climate can be crucial, but NGOs tend to resist it, which could help to make the case for nuclear as part of the energy mix, Sorry, let me repeat the question. The role of nuclear in solving the climate issue can be crucial, but NGOs tend to be resistant to it. See recent analysis of the lower biodiversity of nuclear relative to alternatives, and there's a link provided here, which could help make the case for nuclear as part of the energy mix. Could you speak to that, Matt?
Yeah, no, there's all sorts of challenges around nuclear, and those have played out in different parts of the world, and I wouldn't intend to diminish those. So just to take a quick step back, like the intent wasn't necessarily to sort of recommend nuclear or not. We've looked at the global energy models that are out there, and all of the ones we could find that look at a low carbon future, or one that gives sort of a reasonable chance of avoiding significant or dangerous climate change, do show an increase in nuclear energy. It's possible there are sort of pathways that can avoid that, but we are looking at a really massive shift in the global energy system to achieve that outcome. So I think that the more constraints you impose on it and sort of ruling out options makes that harder and harder to achieve. I think what is a global conclusion in that case certainly may or may not hold up to different individual jurisdictions, and I think Ontario is probably a fairly good example where there's been an active debate around the future of nuclear in the province. That's one where, say, 5-6 years ago, the province looked very likely to be expanding its nuclear capacity. I think the argument's been made pretty convincingly, and the province has changed course really substantially, that the need for that additional nuclear capacity isn't there, and it's probably better met by sort of increases in efficiency and renewables in particular. So I think that role of nuclear is a challenging one and sort of a jurisdiction by jurisdiction debate, as it will be with many of the different energy sources. But I think the reality is, looking at it from a global perspective, the models that are out there are showing nuclear being an increasing part of that energy mix if there's going to be a global shift that's capable of responding to the climate change challenge.
Okay, and a follow-up to that is that the nuclear disaster that we've seen in Japan with Fukushima has resulted in that country moving away and toward LNG-fired power generation. Yet this audience member seems to believe that we're recommending nuclear. Could you speak to that, Matt?
Again, it's not a recommendation one way or another on should an individual jurisdiction use nuclear or not. I think that this is sort of what those global models are showing is that nuclear is playing an increasing role, and Japan's actually a really interesting example where following the Fukushima disaster moved sharply away from nuclear. There's now, I'd say, a very live debate in the country as to what role, if any, it should play going forward, and that's informed in part because of the very high cost of other energy sources they're facing. So I think it's not entirely predictable at this point where they're going to end up in their own energy mix.
Question here for you, Joshua. How do you feel the province is doing in addressing and moving on energy efficiency, since that was a large part of your projected future scenario with strong climate policy?
Yeah, that's a great question. Energy efficiency does play a very significant role with strong climate policy in place. That is, globally, we will see the demand for energy decrease. Here in BC, energy efficiency really needs to be given a little bit more attention within the province than it has been in the last few years. We have seen some good efforts on energy efficiency in the building stock, but a lot of those programs, like the Live Smart program, have been sunset, and there aren't particular plans to replace those in the form that they were originally in. We've seen a few efforts at some pay-as-you-save programs and other things like that, which haven't been particularly successful. It's definitely an area that the province needs to ramp up, needs to set some goals and start to articulate how we're going to be reducing energy use across the board in the province, not just from buildings, in short order. And I think that's something that Matt alluded to, a Climate Action Plan 2.0 maybe looming on the horizon, and if that's the case, one of the things that we would be looking for specifically would be some stronger commitments to some short and medium term goals around reducing energy consumption or increasing energy efficiency in the province.
One for you, Matt. Do you have any comments on projected revenues from BC LNG over time?
Thanks, Kevin. So it's not something we've done detailed work on ourselves, but it is sort of a part of the debate in BC around LNG for sure, and probably two parts to that. One, like the province's revenue and economic estimates have, for the most part, been based on this sort of 5 to 7 LNG plant scenario. So it's a huge amount of development. I think the consensus I'm hearing out there anyways is that's not a particularly realistic projection, and I think most people are saying anywhere from none of these happening to maybe 2 or 3 at an upper end. So with less development, the revenue would be coming from those plants will definitely be smaller, so there's probably an overinflation in those initial estimates from the province. I think there is a really interesting debate in terms of how much revenue the province can expect from a given amount of LNG being exported. The province came up with its own estimates as part of the LNG Income Act bill from the fall as well. Mark Lee from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, I thought, did some good work in sort of looking at some other scenarios. So if there is LNG development that goes ahead, what the actual revenue to the province will be highly dependent on what the selling price of the LNG is going to be, what the development costs in BC are. All those factors sort of have a number of assumptions underlying them that I'd say are fairly unpredictable. So there's, I think, fair to say, a fairly wide range of uncertainty. But at the amount of LNG to be being developed, and therefore the overall sort of LNG base to derive revenue from is likely on the high side, or fairly significantly on the high side based on the numbers the province is using.
So a question for you, Joshua. What about the domestic use of LNG? Do you have any thoughts on the environmental impacts of utilizing natural gas in British Columbia?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. One of the things that I think the modeling from the IEA and others is showing us is that in order for us to transition off of some of the dirtier fossil fuels, there may be a role for natural gas use across the board as a bit of a transition fuel. And as Pat talked about in his presentation, I think there's some talk of LNG as a bridge fuel, and it's probably a term folks have heard. The problem being that bridge is probably shorter and narrower than most people are imagining, but that bridge does exist, and there are specific times and instances where using natural gas or liquefied natural gas domestically in BC or in Canada does actually make sense. I think the piece we want to be really careful about when we start talking about natural gas as a transition fuel is making sure we are doing that with a view to the length of that transition, and that we are not actually simply locking ourselves into a slightly less dirty form of energy when we could be making a jump to a much cleaner form of energy that will stand us in better stead as we move into a future with the stronger climate policies that we talked about. So yes, there are definitely some instances where that makes sense, but it needs to be considered a short-term transition opportunity in most cases.
Question for you, Matt. What do you think the prognosis is for China or others to introduce coal punitive or natural gas supportive policies? So an increase in gas supply would enable them to do so while maintaining energy security.
Thanks, Kevin. It's an interesting question. I think there's a perception out there that countries like China aren't doing anything on the problem of climate change, and there's actually quite a bit happening already. So this is more a question of, can we scale up those activities in a significant way as opposed to just getting them started. So again, looking at the example of China, significant investor and the world's largest investor in renewable energy. They also have a number of what they're describing as carbon pricing pilot programs, and we sort of hear pilot programs, I think something small, but in many cases these pilot programs are applying to populations that are bigger than Canada as a whole. So quite a bit happening. And then I mentioned earlier in the presentation the agreement that the China, bilateral agreement that U.S. and China signed around climate change. And I think it definitely sort of points to some opportunities and sign for optimism. If you look at sort of where that agreement and the commitments in it fall relative to sort of the weak climate change, strong climate change dichotomy we've used in this presentation, at least in terms of the International Energy Agency results, that if they are able to follow through on those commitments in China, it sort of puts them halfway between those two. So I'd say a substantive step ahead of a business as usual or weak climate change policy world, but also still a ways to go if we want to get all the way to that sort of climate-friendly outcome. So pieces definitely in place, and I think ongoing exploration and testing of policies in China in particular. Still fair to say fairly big questions as to what degree they'll be able to follow through on some of those, some of that intent.
Question for you, Joshua. Does the cost of the options go into this analysis? That is, renewables tend to be extremely expensive and don't contribute a significant amount to the current energy mix. So this audience member says, I don't see how renewables can be a part of that solution. Can you speak to that, Joshua?
Yeah, sure. So the modeling work that we did look at from the IEA and others did not have costing information there. But I think what we're talking about when we're talking about strong climate policy are policies that are going to shift decision-making and investment decision-making away from dirtier sources towards cleaner sources. And as we put those types of policies in place, whether or not they're market mechanisms like carbon pricing or carbon taxes, which make the economic case stronger for renewables and less appealing and eventually, fairly impossible or difficult for dirtier sources of energy, that we'll start to see those shifts happen. So whether or not it's those market kinds of mechanisms or regulatory mechanisms that are shifting towards renewables, energy efficiency, and nuclear, it is only in the presence of those strong policies that shift is going to be able to take place at the pace and scale that has been indicated in the modeling. Without those policies in place, and with sort of counter policies, similar things to fossil fuel subsidies and the like, we will continue to struggle with that cost disparity.
Okay, a question for you, Matt. I understand that a strong climate policy, a world in which there's strong climate policies in place, would make LNG more viable as a better energy source than coal. But if we actually had strong global climate policies in place, wouldn't we then be fully engaged in developing renewable, sustainable energies, and thus making LNG quite irrelevant?
Thanks, Kevin. The first half of that statement I would totally agree with. I think if we have that strong climate policy in place, as one of the earlier slides shows, that investments in renewables, nuclear as we discussed, and in particular energy efficiency become the big shift that the world does see. So we'll start to, there is a role for gas there. We didn't actually show it, but the role for coal and oil in particular is very small, and the demand globally essentially sort of drops off a cliff. But you are looking at a role for natural gas. We're not able to sort of break that into sort of natural gas via pipeline versus LNG. So I think there's an open question as to whether or not there is a role for LNG or a role for other types of gas, how that role gets divided between the two sources. It's not something we looked at as part of this research, but it is an interesting question. So I wouldn't go as far as to say that gas is irrelevant, but as we said, the demand is much smaller than in the world without climate policy, and you're sort of looking at something that's going to peak in the not too distant future and again decline below current levels by mid-century. So a role there, but a much smaller one.
Perhaps this is a question for both of you. What is the main policy improvement the government should focus on during the Paris talks? In this case, I assume the audience member is asking about the provincial government, but in either case, maybe if you have recommendations for federal or provincial, that would be useful. So again, what is the main policy improvement the government should focus on during the Paris talks? Joshua.
Sure, thanks, Kevin. So I'll take the question actually in two ways. I think the BC government has a role to play in terms of helping to promote climate solutions as well, and I think that was one of our recommendations. I think it's recommendation 3, and the Paris climate talks are an excellent example of that. So I think thinking about BC's role in terms of promoting some of the solutions and the successes we've seen here in BC is very important, and top of the list there for me would be carbon pricing, and specifically sharing the successes of BC's carbon tax. From a domestic point of view, what should BC be focusing on in terms of policy improvement for BC itself? I would actually stick with the same answer, and I think it would be good to start looking at how we can start increasing and broadening our own carbon tax now that we're seeing the policy environment shifting both within Canada and also internationally around the acceptance and implementation of carbon pricing around the world. And I think that puts BC, that changes the context from when the original freeze was put in place on the carbon tax. And so I think thinking through how BC's carbon tax relates to those other examples and what that means for our own internal policy and how we can start to, as I said, increase and broaden our own carbon tax would be a key priority.
I can add a little bit I agree with that entirely from a provincial perspective, and maybe just to add a little bit from a federal perspective in Canada, because the question seems to apply to both. I think if we look federally in Canada, the government has unfortunately really had a sort of neutral to negative role in the international climate process over the last 10 years or so. So I think at a minimum coming in a much more constructive and engaged way in those talks and trying to really work towards solutions instead of working against them would be the starting point. And we see this awkward dynamic in Lima from earlier this year where you've got provincial governments such as BC, Quebec, and Ontario, I think rightly trumpeting some of the positive things they've done and being starkly out of alignment with, I think, some of the steps being taken at the federal level. So whether that is with the approach they've sort of aligned themselves with to date in terms of sort of sector-by-sector regulations or moving ahead with something in carbon pricing, I think there's a range of opportunities and lots of low-hanging fruit for the federal government to get in a much better place. So I wouldn't be prescriptive as to what, but being at least in a positive and constructive place would be much better for Canada's reputation and the prospects of an international agreement.
Okay, thanks both. A question here for Joshua. If the reason for BC's LNG interest is revenue, then can we conclude that BC has a large incentive to discourage strong climate policies domestically and worldwide?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I wouldn't want to comment on the specific intentions of the BC government in terms of their policy making. I think this is a challenge, and I think this is something that the government and we as British Columbians do need to wrestle with. Is how do we hold both of these things at the same time? I think the flip side of this question is that yeah, there is obviously a strong interest in revenue for LNG, if not the main interest for the development of LNG from the BC government. When we think about it from a long-term economic development perspective, however, and we do think about that peaking in 2030, and we think about natural gas demand dropping below current levels by mid-century, I think there's a question about whether or not that is an economically wise choice for the province to be making in terms of the sustainability of our economy going forward. So in the sense that there are other opportunities in terms of clean energy economy development, clean technology development, and those other pieces that we could equally be throwing the horsepower behind to develop for revenue generation purposes and for the strength and sustainability of our economy, it may be a good moment to start thinking about why strong climate policy would benefit those other pieces and would benefit the economic development of British Columbia if we were to go in that other direction as opposed to LNG. So I think it's an excellent question. I think it is a bit of it's a big challenge for us right now. My hope is that challenge does prompt the BC government to start thinking about options that are more compatible with strong climate policy.
Okay. Matt, will anyone, any place, any time seek to impose a carbon tax on BC, i.e. the producer of natural gas, on the carbon released when BC LNG is burned, so downstream?
There's sort of issue of whether it's carbon tariffs or other approaches to almost apply climate policy outside of your own jurisdiction is one that has been growing in interest over the last several years. I think a lot of that will depend on what BC does with its own policy going ahead, and I think in the last 5 years you can look at BC arguably being sort of on the leading edge of climate policy, and even I guess sort of being at the opposite end of this spectrum of, in essence, trying to impose climate policy in Alberta through its low carbon fuel standards. So that's a policy that's sort of reaching further up the supply chain to try to require fuel providers to reduce the carbon intensity of their fuels. Could that shift over time? Absolutely, and I think actually the U.S. climate legislation from a few years ago that didn't quite get through their legislative processes, but was fairly close, had this idea of carbon tariffs built into it. So if the U.S. in that case was trading with a jurisdiction that had weaker climate policy, they would have given themselves the power to impose carbon tariffs or in this instead of a carbon tax on those jurisdictions. So looking ahead, BC certainly has the opportunity to control that by continuing to move ahead with its climate policy. But if it doesn't, that risk is certainly there as other jurisdictions move ahead.
Question for you, Matt. Lately, oil and power corporations are recognizing the profit that can be realized from renewables. So they've been investing in things like solar and wind power heavily. This is likely to increase now with the reduction in the oil price. These are the same companies who lobby heavily for oil subsidies. So do you see a shift to renewable subsidies anytime soon?
That's a good question. Really interesting times with the drop in oil prices, and I think it's hard to predict where governments will go in terms of the supportive policies, whether it's subsidies or other approaches. But no question, the returns on oil investments today are not as good as they would have been sort of looking at some of those projects a few years ago. So the opportunity to step in with policies to support that transition is in some ways better than it's ever been. So hopefully that's the case. I think it's very hard to predict where governments will go.
Okay, realizing we've actually run over time here, I think we're going to close there. Just a reminder that if you'd like to receive email updates from us, please take a look at our website. You can go to pembina.org/subscription. Lots more information coming out in the future about LNG, energy efficiency, and other topics across Canada. So thank you, everybody, for attending our webinar, and have a great afternoon.